It's always just between us, right?
Hello and welcome into Between Us at 938 Live, sharing real inspiring stories that will move and uplift you, as well as tackling issues that really matter to you. You're tuned to Between Us. I'm Angela Lim, and lovely of you to join us. And today we're chatting a bit about HIV, marriage and sex, and the whole idea of how a recent academic study that AWARE conducted last year showed that among respondents who were married and diagnosed with HIV or AIDS, more than half reported being infected by their husbands. It seems the way we talk about HIV, marriage and sex can put women's health at serious risk, and here to share some of the stories of these women and the struggle they go through and what we can do about that as well as Vivienne, Research and Advocacy Director at AWARE. Vivienne, so nice to have you with us.
Yes, thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about how you first got started with this study, because the findings are interesting. A group of women who we don't really hear much from, because, you know, a lot of them there is a stigma attached to HIV. There's still a lot that people don't know about it. Why did you decide to do this study in particular?
Yes, actually the study has been going on for a while, and it was started in 2006 by AWARE's former president, Brema Mathi, and the focus was on married women with HIV, especially for that reason that you just mentioned. There's hardly any attention given to them. If we look at the number of people in Singapore who have HIV, there are about 5,775 altogether. The overwhelming majority are male. About slightly less than 10% are female. But of the female persons who have got HIV/AIDS, more than half are married.
Right. So these are some very interesting statistics I think many of us, might not be very sure of at any given point of time. But tell us about, the focus on the women who do have HIV. You did the study, speaking very closely to about 50 women.
Yes.
Is that right?
50 married women and 5 single women.
Okay.
Actually, the intention was to also have single women, but it was very difficult to find single women who were willing to be respondents.
Could you share a little bit, from your personal experience, Vivienne, conducting the study and also in your many years at AWARE? Why is it so difficult as a woman, and maybe men as well, to come forward to share their experiences, knowing that there's so much value in putting this information out there?
Well, first of all, many of the women don't know they have AIDS until either they have passed it to their children, or they have, in the process of pregnancy, they go for their antenatal tests, or they start falling ill. And so they kind of discover it accidentally.
Okay.
And it's not like they don't themselves feel they are actually indulging in risky behavior. So in some cases, the women thought that they were safe because they were monogamous, they were in quite stable marriages. And even though some of them might be suspicious of their husbands having, affairs, they didn't kind of think that would happen.
Right. I think there's, on some level, still a mentality that it can't happen to me. We all think that way sometimes, that we get a little bit confident that, it sounds awful, but no, I'm safe, I'm okay.
Yeah, and also there's quite a bit of misconception about HIV/AIDS. Some of the women who had the infection thought that this was something that could only affect promiscuous women, or could only affect homosexuals, or could only affect sex workers. So they didn't think that, being married and having sex with only one guy would also, land them in this situation.
So when you do talk to these women, that's an awful sort of situation to be in.
Actually, the study was done by a whole team, and I would like to mention them. So we work with the Saw Swee-Hock School of Public Health at NUS, and the clients came from the Centre for Communicable Diseases, Tan Tock Seng, and the Department of Sexually Transmitted Illnesses Control Clinic, the DSC.
Okay. So you've actually collaborated with these organizations to get to these women. Why was it so important that, apart from quantitative results, you actually do still want to speak to these women on a one-on-one personal basis to get the qualitative information? Why was that important to you, Vivienne?
Because we wanted to know about their experiences and to know how they felt and what their thoughts were when they discovered. Many of them, were very shocked when they were presented with the diagnosis, and and they had different responses. In those cases that we call seroconcordant, that means they are HIV positive and the husbands are also HIV positive. This could even, make the couple feel that they are together. Sometimes the whole family has got HIV positive because even the children have gotten the infection.
And both weren't aware, sometimes?
You see, in some cases, the husbands were the ones who brought the infection back from having, extramarital relations, either with sex workers or with girlfriends and so on.
Okay.
And generally what we have found is that, the women have seen themselves as passive partners in the relationship. So they have had great difficulty, even when they had wanted the husband to use condoms when having sex outside marriage. And in some cases, they're not even trying to control the husband's sexual behavior, but to say, be safe. There's no way they would know whether the husband has used condoms.
Right.
And we even have some cases where the husbands became abusive when the wives asked for the husbands to use condoms.
Definitely these are issues that we do want to raise, we want to bring to the spotlight on some level, because a lot of studies are out there that are very quantitative. We have a lot of figures out there that show us how many women, how many men, how badly affected the population is, but very seldom do we have studies where you actually have a very qualitative assessment of the problem. You have the stories behind it. In a way, a lot of these women are afraid to come forward to say their piece, but I think, Vivienne, you're being here today, being the voices for these women will be a very powerful message. We're going to hear a lot more from Vivienne about the stories behind the women who suffer from AIDS, and also how they have sometimes been infected by their husbands and not been aware of it, how their families have been coping as a result of it, and what we can do to prevent more of this happening. All this coming up on Between Us when we continue in just a bit. Stay tuned here on 938 Live.
Reset your relationships in Between Us. Our soulful encounter is always just between us on 938 Live.
Vivienne Weiss, my guest today, Research and Advocacy Director at AWARE, sharing with us about a recent study that she's conducted and she spearheaded as well with her team about quantitative data that they found as well from speaking to about 50 or so women who have AIDS, and they've also come forward to share their personal reasons for coming forward to you, Vivienne, per se. Many of them, I'm sure, at the start must have been quite afraid to say what they had to say to you.
Yeah, first I want to mention that the study was done done completely by the Sosui School of Public Health at NUS. It was done on behalf of AWARE because we don't have direct access to the women who have been diagnosed with HIV/AIDS, and identities are kept confidential.
Right, definitely. Of course, we will keep those anonymous, of course, but we do want to find out a little bit more about the situation as well. And you being in a very much optimum position as well to share this, because you've spoken to these women directly as well. The whole study was done by a team, so it's very difficult to say which team member has been interviewing which patient. Right. But based on your experiences, you mentioned one of the reasons why the women do find it difficult to stand up for themselves.
Right. So I'm talking about the report of the study, which was done by this team. And what has been found is that many of the women found it very difficult to get their husbands to use condoms. So of the 50 married women who were interviewed, only 2 succeeded in asking their husbands to use condoms almost all of the time. And what's striking is that in those 2 cases, the women were HIV positive and the men were HIV negative. So, in other words, the men were willing to use the condoms when their health were at stake. But it was interesting that there are at least 2 other cases which are of this type. The wife is HIV positive and the husband is not, where the husbands didn't want to use condoms.
Right. In the instance of, you think about these situations and you think the women are in such a position where they can't negotiate for what they want. What do you think this means? I mean, in Singapore, you think that this doesn't happen. What are some of your discoveries?
Actually, in a way we have found that many women feel that to be feminine, they should be passive, they shouldn't be too active in sex, and they shouldn't behave like they know too much or to demand too much. As a result, it is left to the man to take the sexual initiative. So this has been definitely the case with all these interviews that we've had, that the women have been very passive in their sexual relations.
Right. And the results, of course, are really quite long-term and very, very drastic for them. Share with us maybe some examples that you have in terms of when you chat with these women. Was it difficult to get them to share?
Again, I have to speak on behalf of the team rather than myself.
Yeah.
And the relationships were built up over time, and it wasn't like a single interview. And also, these were kind of patients who had been diagnosed with HIV AIDS, and that's why they went through the formal channels like the Communicable Disease Center, Tan Tock Seng, and the Department of STI Control. So actually Aware is not in direct contact with these patients.
Right. So let's talk a little bit more in just a bit as well about some of the findings that, are part of this study, and also some of the stories that you can share as well about these women and what they've been through in terms of not being able to stand up for themselves, and at the same time, having trouble dealing with AIDS, and of course how we can, moving forward, help them out as well. All this continues right after headline news and sports. When Between Us continues in just a bit.
Man is a knot into which relationships are tied, but nothing comes between us. On 938 Live. Reset your relationships in Between Us.
Welcome back into Between Us and 938 Live, sharing today the stories of the women affected by AIDS, and also how we can actually do a little bit more as a society or as individuals to help prevent this from happening and to make sure that it doesn't happen to anyone we really care about as well. Vivienne Wee is my guest today, and she's Research and Advocacy Director at Aware. Vivienne, you've been sharing so far about the context of the study, which is important, of course, the idea that we need to know that there are people out there who are afraid to come forward to talk, but we actually have a vast amount of data now as well to tap on for us to understand what goes on behind the scenes. When you do speak to the people who conducted the study, and of course based on the study's results, what are some of these issues that the women do bring up as something that troubles them or makes it difficult for them to come out to share about their experiences?
Well, first, they are shocked when they find out that they have AIDS. And secondly, they are afraid to disclose it to others around them, be it their family, their friends, their colleagues, their employers, because they are very often stigmatized. So in the study that we are doing, where we're looking at married women who, through no fault of their own, because they have been monogamous and, just limiting their sex life to basically their husband, still, get infected by their husband. Nevertheless, they are very often blamed that they must have done something wrong and so on. So therefore, they feel like doubly victimized because they got the HIV AIDS without their knowledge. And then even after getting it, they very often don't receive the support that they need.
Right.
So this is why Aware is issuing a video to encourage women to go for testing, so that they shouldn't kind of like be afraid that they would be blamed if they were found to have the illness.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about that fear, I suppose, because as a society, I'm sure that many of us, we see and we hear what these women go through. It's hard not to kind of empathize and to feel that, as a disease, it must be difficult to cope with already, much less the stigma that comes later on as well, especially if your children are also affected. That must be really heartbreaking as parents. Let's talk a bit about some of the stories that the researchers have managed to share with you. Could you tell us about some of those, Vivienne?
Yeah, for example, some of them, they find that their relatives and their family members suddenly don't want to be near them, don't want to eat with them, and some are even putting on gloves, to kind of approach them, but not even touching them. So there was this kind of a very irrational kind of fear, which is just based on ignorance, basically. And then what is worse is that if they get stigmatized at their workplace, they lose their jobs, then they can't afford the medication, which can be quite costly.
Right.
Yeah.
It must seem, like quite a bleak sort of situation to be in without the kind of support and without the understanding, even from their closest loved ones. Tell us a bit about any other concerns that they tend to have, especially with coping with this, knowing that the disease came from the husbands, and quite more than half, actually, as you mentioned earlier, found that the disease actually was passed on from the husband.
Yeah.
How have they managed to cope going forward?
At first, they would be very angry with the husband, but in the end, they come to terms with it. And some of them even find it within their capacity to forgive the husband. But what is tragic is that very often the children are infected as well. So the whole family, has this kind of infection. So they are definitely in a very difficult situation, and economically they are, suffering. And it's compounded when they are foreign women married to Singaporean men and who are not permanent residents, because they don't have long-term visas to reside here, and if the husband were to die before they die, they would lose a sponsor, they will lose their residence, and the children will be left here stranded because the HIV mother has been sent back to her home country.
To your knowledge, Vivienne, what kind of support is currently available right now for these families? Because we're hearing about the situation, it's really quite risky for either of these parents if anything happens to them, and with regard to health, it's very hard to say. What is currently being done?
It's quite heartening that some of the participants in this research, at least about 20%, said that they themselves have formed a peer support group, and they are able to share their experiences, and they even kind of pool resources together to get drugs, especially from other countries, which are selling them at cheaper cost than in Singapore. Like, for instance, one woman who is a 34-year-old Indonesian woman who is HIV positive and married to an HIV negative husband, had a rather supportive mother-in-law who consoled her by saying, "Cry for what? Don't you want to stay in your marriage? I don't want to see you die. You did not kill people. You did not take other people's things. This being HIV positive is okay. Never mind."
Right.
So this was quite an unusual mother-in-law who not only didn't blame this foreign wife married to her HIV negative son, but even, was supportive of her.
Right. That's exactly, I think, an example of what we're going toward. I hope, as a society as well, that we can all look beyond the disease, beyond the stigma attached to it. And we can say, even though most mother-in-laws perhaps at this point might look at it and say, oh dear, I really don't want my son to have to deal with the challenges involved with an illness. But on some level, to look beyond it, to also see that it's not the person's fault. I think that's something that we all tend to look at with regard to the stigma, which is that if you are HIV positive, you've done something to deserve it. We need to remove that stigma first of all, to give the women or the men as well a chance to get better and to be accepted in society. Let's find out more about the challenges faced by these women who have HIV or AIDS, and also what we can do as a society to move forward and to provide more support with regard to the challenges involved in this area. My guest today is Vivienne Wee, Research and Advocacy Director at Aware, and we'll continue this conversation in just a bit.
It's always just between us, all right? Our soulful encounter is always just between us on 938 Live.
Chatting about the stories and challenges about the women who face HIV or AIDS, and how we are actually, as a society or as individuals, how we can support them and actually help all of them do a little bit better as well. My guest today is Vivienne Wee, she's Research and Advocacy Director at Aware, and she's been sharing some of their stories so far. Vivienne, going forward, based on what you've said, there are people in society who are very, very supportive as well. How can we amplify this sort of positivity about HIV? What's been done right now based on your observations?
Actually, about 1/6 of the women did have supportive friends in their circle. So one participant, for example, said that she went out for a meal with her friend after revealing her illness to him. And this friend went to find out for himself about HIV, and then he realized that it wasn't something that could be passed through contact or through, everyday, interactions. So that when they had the meal together, this friend said, "It's okay, we shall just eat from the same dish," and didn't go to great lengths to not eat with her. So he did not discriminate against this HIV woman, in any way, and this woman found that to be very affirming and supportive.
Right. Simple acts like that. I love how you mentioned that. It's such a simple thing. Things like eating off the same plate, hugging the person. Just showing that you're not afraid of the illness, so the person doesn't have to be afraid as well. Offering that source of support. Sometimes in flinching or being afraid of things we don't understand or we don't know, can really be very detrimental to the morale and the ability to stay strong for these people who have the illness. Tell us more about what you think, based on your observations and your experiences as well, we can all do as individuals for these people.
Well, I think for a start, we should not, identify them as only HIV/AIDS patients. Like that is their defining characteristic. They are still people, and they still, are, replete with their, interests, their needs, their talents, Well,
everyone on some level has many facets to their personality, and fixating on something like that is very narrow-minded, I suppose.
Yeah, so that's the thing that actually, is very reducing, and then they become nothing but an HIV/AIDS patient.
Okay, so remove the label. That's a big one. In small ways, like you've just mentioned, also the simple acts, reach out. Find out more, first of all. Educate yourself. Now the information is everywhere on the internet. It's so easy to find out more about the disease. And also, in a way, reach out to them on a personal level. What can we do if we want to help out? If there are people who currently need help, let's say the whole family is affected by AIDS, or they might have financial concerns. How can anyone who's listening now and wants to do something to change that for them, how can they reach out?
I think the first thing is to listen and to find out what they need, because we can't, imagine and just impose what we think to be their needs on them. So they may have financial needs, or they may not, and they may need, more kind of, counseling, and they may need friends, they may need a job, they may need, all kinds of things, information. So the needs are quite diverse, and I think the first task of anybody who wants to help is to listen.
Right. And, of course, if there's anything that anyone would like to do with regard to the issue or find out more about the study, you can go to the website www.aware.org.sg. Now, on a final note, Vivienne, anything you'd like to say as a message to our listeners to encourage them, perhaps, or anyone who's listening now, perhaps, who is suffering from AIDS and would like to do something about it and change whatever is happening to them in terms of challenges, what would you suggest?
Yeah. As we have learned, and we are ourselves not medical practitioners or researchers, as our colleagues in the Salisbury Hall School of Public Health has told us, with the standard of medication that's now available, people with HIV/AIDS can actually live quite normal lives. And we don't actually have to fear contagion, because actually many of these women live with HIV-positive husbands for years, and it's only because the husbands refuse to use condoms that they got infected. So unless you're going to have that kind of sex without protection with a HIV-positive partner, then maybe you're at risk. But otherwise, we can interact normally with HIV AIDS infected people like people.
Right, of course, and very simple things, as mentioned as well. Simple steps you can take to make people feel better, more hopeful about the situation. All this helped along, of course, by the study, as mentioned by Vivienne Wee today, who is telling us more about how, we can actually do our part based on the qualitative information that we've gotten from the studies, chatting with these 50 or so women personally to find out more about their stories. More updates, as always, you can go to www.aware.org.sg. Vivienne, such a pleasure having you here today.
Thank you.
Vivienne Wee is my guest, and she's a Research and Advocacy Director at Aware, sharing with us the personal stories of the women who suffer with AIDS. Between Us ends right now, and this has been Angela Lim. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Man is a knot into which relationships are tied, but nothing comes between us. On 938 Live.